I really want to talk with everyone today about does it mean to restore our connection to nature, and in particular, what does it mean to restore our connection to water? Sound is very staticky. I think we'll try and have some moderators maybe look into that. Any other sound issues coming for folks before we really do a big dive in? Okay, hearing none, I think I'll keep going. So just to start off, I want to, wonderful, Kenzie says she's hearing it great. In these virtual times, so akwe winikusak kaslina nisong chinakak nadoche. So hello and welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Kelsey Leonard, as was mentioned in the introduction. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo in the Faculty of Environment. But what really centers me is that I am a Shinnecock woman, and currently, living in Southern Ontario. I'm a visitor here, and I think you probably had some land acknowledgements or territorial acknowledgements that were done to start out the day in a good way. If they weren't, then I'm here to hopefully provide some of that. And being a visitor in this part of Turtle Island, I give thanks for the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples for allowing us all to be here and for welcoming us to their territory. So for me, being Shinnecock, I am from Indigenous nation, tribal nation as it's referred to in the United States, on the southern shores of Long Island, as you can see in the map here, what we call Paumanok, in what's currently known as New York State. So I am a coastal Algonquin woman, and we are, have a long tradition of whaling and fishing, and a lot of things to do also with shellfish. So in this part of the region, for a lot of the treaty belts that you may be aware of that are constituted out of wampum. Wampum is made from whelk and quahog shells that come from eastern Atlantic shores. Particularly, my nation is well known for the bounty of those species in our waters. So that kind of situates how I understand my own connection to water. As a Shinnecock woman, and Shinnecock in our language means people of the stony shore. So, inherent in my identity as a Shinnecock is that connection to water. And I think, for everyone around the world, no matter where you are, you have a connection to water. And I'll talk a little bit more about where that connection comes from. But I really want you, over the course of this session and over the course of the remainder of your time with Watershed 2020, to really think about, what is my connection to water? Where does it come from? Where do I find the hope and resiliency for water protection in my everyday life? For me, it definitely is related to my home community. Well, also, what I'm going to share with you today is a little bit of research and principles that I've gathered through the science that I've been conducting around water protection, and particularly also some legal scholarship around the legal granting of legal personhood for water. But it's captured and distilled in a very wonderful way in a TED talk that I gave last year called Why Lakes and Rivers Should Have the Same Rights as Humans. And so if you are finding that after today you want to learn more, or you want to sort of have something that you can share with your community, with your family, definitely encourage you to take a look at that TED Talk and share it widely, because I think a big part of the message for today is also captured in that talk. So I want to start, and if you orient yourself to the chat box, there's make sure you're clicking on session, and in there you can type in some of your thoughts or answers to this question. And I'd really like to start our conversation about, what is our connection to water? How do we restore our connection to water? By starting here. What is water? So, feel free to type into the chat box, what is water to you? Water is life, great. Definitely have a few folks in there. It's wet, okay, yes, so that liquid aspect. Connection, great. Water is us, yes. We think about our physical makeup as a human species. We are mostly made up of water. Water is drinking, cooking, bathing, energy, vital, peace, a spiritual connection, soothing. These are wonderful. And I think, the audience that we have here today is a very unique audience. So we might be in a little bit of an echo chamber, because sometimes when I ask this question, what is water? I, get a lot of the physical or the biophysical components of water. It's a liquid, H2O, it's a lake, it's a river, it's the ocean, it's an iceberg, it's snow, so all the different sort of biophysical manifestations of water that we see in our everyday lives. But now I want you to think about how fundamentally different the way in which we approach water protection, water governance, our individual connections with water might be if instead of saying, what is water, we said, who is water? In the same way that someone might ask you about a family member, right? Maybe, who is your aunt or who is your grandmother? When you respond to that question, you're providing personality characteristics, you're providing a name, you're providing, maybe where they grew up, you're providing a bit of all of these sort of personal background attributes that make that person whole. And even more so, you're defining your connection to that person as your relative, right? You're describing how that person came, or how you came to be that person's relative, right? How they came to be your aunt, how you came to be their niece, how you came to be their nephew. And that is the type of fundamental transformation that we need in international water conservation policy. We need to stop asking solely what is water or what is the water body that we are concerned with protecting, and who is water. How do we fundamentally, both on the individual level and on the nation state level and at maybe local, municipal, provincial levels, how are we relating to that water? What is our level of care and responsibility, and even more so, a duty of care to the water? And that's a pretty big transformation. Not too many folks are, in my opinion, asking the right questions in order to be able to develop the right solutions. So I want us to take a step back then. Where does this bifurcation come from? Well, I think in a lot of ways, the what is water question is something that we find in a lot of the dominant water regimes around the world. The regimes that are predominantly influenced by Western science, and particularly biophysical sciences, and not so much influenced by indigenous knowledge systems, indigenous ways of knowing, or indigenous science that have an alternative way in which we view water, which is to ask the question, who is water, prior to developing any solutions to some of the big water challenges or wicked water problems that we see in our world today. And that difference, that duality, that bifurcation between sort of Western world and the indigenous world, I think is centered around principles that are taught to us as indigenous peoples when we're very young, but then also throughout our lifetime, right? That connection to water is maintained across our entire lifetime, where in the Western world, we may have that connection at the start of our lifetime, which is something that I'll speak towards as well. But over the course of time, we lose it because it's not maintained through our education systems, through our everyday activities. We just start to see water as something that is only for human benefit and use and a commodity for our pleasure, as opposed to a relation that we have a responsibility and a duty towards protecting. So from an indigenous perspective, we're starting out with the notion and the philosophy that water is our first medicine. And what that means is that water is the, one of the four elements on this planet that nurtures us as we're born into existence as human beings on this planet. Because we are carried in the womb, in water for 9 months or around there, depending on if you're a preemie baby or not. And that is really the foundation of our natal connection to water. Everybody on this planet, every human being on this planet is born with a natal connection to water. And the question is, when does that connection get severed? Is it after birth and it's just not nurtured? Is it during our primary education? Is it during our tertiary education? Is it just that we've created a system of laws that don't allow for the nurturing of that connection to water and responsibility towards water? And I would lean towards mostly towards the latter, but it's a combination of everything. But I do think that the laws are a reflection of our moral compass in society, and that they are significantly deficient in being able to maintain and restore that connection to water in our everyday lives today. So you all are here today for a session on water justice, right? Okay, well, you might have heard this term quite a lot, but what is water justice? Well, really, it's saying that in the decisions that we make about water, for water, that there should be fairness, equity, and participation. But I add another key component, and I think that's where Indigenous epistemologies of water justice really come into play. It's that we have a foundational principle of relationality and a foundational responsibility and duty towards the water of relationality. When you add that in, water justice becomes not just justice of fairness, equity, and participation in decision-making by human beings, but when you add in relationality, it also becomes about what is the judicial and the experience of justice for other non-human relations, the other beings on this planet that we connect to and are supported by. So when we think about where we currently are in the Great Lakes region of both, what may be currently known as Canada and the United States, this map shows that in the drainage basin, we have over 200 First Nations, Indigenous nations throughout the territory. And when we think about how then does that inform our decision making, our understanding of water justice, fairness, equity, participation, we have some massive challenges and some massive failures because there isn't equity or fairness or participation for all Indigenous peoples and nations in the governance of the Great Lakes or in the governance of water for this region. There's actually massive water injustices that are happening throughout the Great Lakes, not just in Indigenous communities and other communities of color and communities that are economically depressed, because we are lacking this fundamental understanding of how to restore connection to water. And also that water justice is a principle we all should be subscribing to in terms of making sure that there is equity, fairness, and participation in how we protect and advocate for the water. So why is this all important? Well, as some of you have mentioned before, and I think you may have received some guiding documents today, the world's water is very finite. I think, one of the things that was so perplexing to me about living in the Great Lakes and working in the Great Lakes and being a part of the International Joint Commission Great Lakes Water Quality Board is there is such a feeling or an understanding here in the Great Lakes, an opinion here in the Great Lakes of the public that the water is endless. Oh, we're in the Great Lakes. We're never going to have water issues. Well, we already are seeing massive water issues in the Great Lakes, and those issues, may not be as dire as other parts of the world, but that doesn't mean it's too far off from our future. And so I really, want us to also transform the way in which we think about the world's water. It is not this, endless renewable resource for human consumption and use. It's very finite, and it's in need of protection, and it's in need of more stewardship and honest relationality in how we are relating to the water and consuming the water. So a part of this, and some folks had mentioned earlier, the climate crisis, and we also like to refer to this sort of age that we're in as the Anthropocene. So this age where it's been this period probably for maybe about the past 100 years, although there's some great work by Indigenous scholar Zoe Todd, who says that the Anthropocene actually started, and others, along with some Black scholars as well, but say that the Anthropocene started in 1492, started at the sort of precipice of global colonization and sort of the colonization of the New World. And really it's this age in which we say that human activity has been the dominant influence in the changes that we're seeing to our climate and environment. So why is this important when we're thinking about water, right? What's the actual impacts of our human activity on water? Well, the World Wildlife Foundation just came out with a report this month called the Living Planet Report, and said that human activity has wiped out 2/3 of the world's wildlife since 1970. So there's now a multitude of studies and data that is really supporting this statement or this argument that we are living in the Anthropocene. And what was so fascinating to me about this report is that the most dramatic decline was in freshwater ecosystems. And one of the directors for World Wildlife Foundation said, you begin to see a picture of an unraveling of nature that is alarming. And I think alarming even by our own measures of alarming. We really thought with the efforts that were going on that we would see change in the direction. So what this says to me is that our freshwater ecosystems are the ones that are being most impacted by this dramatic decline in other non-human species. And that relates to our inability to protect water. And I think fundamentally, that is linked to our failure to restore our connection to water. What we're doing right now isn't really helping because the decline is still occurring. So maybe we need to try something different. We have a choice, right? If we're saying we're going to try something different, we have a choice. And I really love this image because we have a choice to continue to consume at a pace of gluttony. We consume more than we need. And that leads us into this dire climate crisis that we are seeing today. But we also have a choice to choose an alternative path where we are looking towards restoration, rehabilitation, and our planet may be past a point of full recovery, but we can at least choose not to destroy it any more than it already is. So all of this comes into understanding that we are in a time of not only climate crisis, but water crises. So you may have heard about the water crises that have occurred in Cape Town, South Africa, where just a few years ago they were sort of rationing water because of a massive drought that hit the region. Now that was a major city in one of the world's largest metropolises that is dealing with a water crisis. You also may have seen that in Chennai, India, there was another water crisis. Again, these sort of major metropolises. Sometimes when it happens in smaller communities, indigenous communities, we're sort of seen as this sort of one-off, even though we know that it's happening at a disproportionate rate compared to other communities around the world. But somehow there's this shock factor when it happens in a major metropolis like Cape Town or Chennai, and even Flint, Michigan, right? We, really sort of that shock of not only the duration, but the level of contamination and continued desecration of human health that the community is still facing to this day. And I mentioned the Indigenous water crises. When we think about our First Nations, Neskantaga First Nation has been on a boiled water advisory since 1995. Grassy Narrows First Nation has been in the news throughout this year, really trying to work with the Liberal government and Prime Minister Trudeau to get a facility to help with the filtration and restoration of the mercury poisoning happening in that community. Now, this has been going on for decades, and we're just now seeing some type of movement in working towards rehabilitation of these communities. And we are far from getting to a place of these communities being healthy and having water that is healthy and thriving. And yet, the other sort of flabbergasting moment of all of this, and just how, human societies are so complex, is that when Indigenous people stand up for water, stand up for our right to have clean water, just like every other human being on the planet has a human right to water, we are often treated as terrorists. We are treated as sort of these violent blockaders, or these violent un-Canadians that aren't sort of following the rule of law. But if it's any other community and they are standing up for their right to water, they are not treated that way. It's seen as as an injustice, as a water injustice. And so why is there that disparate treatment? And a lot of it links to colonialism. A lot of it links to the fact that in exercising our sovereignty and exercising our rights to self-determination, that is a threat to the colonial state. That is a threat to the Canadian state. And so even in trying to restore our connection to water and trying to ensure that everyone has a right to clean water, that is seen as a threat to the colonial state. And it's something that we have to learn to overcome. And I think a big way that we can do that is by asking us this question: who is justice for? Is it just for humans? Can it be for the water as well? Is justice just for folks whose skin color is white? I mean, we have to ask ourselves, who is justice for? The Canadian Rights Charter of Rights and Freedoms, really laid out a foundational ideology of who justice should be for. And yet we still see so many injustices throughout what's currently known as Canada. So one step I will take as we kind of close out a bit of this keynote, and some final thoughts to leave you with, is that legal personhood could be one tool within a much broader toolbox of solutions that I hope you will hear throughout the course of Watershed 2020. But I do think that granting legal personhood to water is one solution that can help us restore our connection to water and restore the healthiness and the wellness of the planet. And a big part of legal personhood for water is recognizing that, as I showed you in that map before, here in the Great Lakes region, there's over 200 Indigenous nations that already have legal personhood for water in some form or another embedded within their legal systems, and in many instances embedded within the original treaties with the provinces or the Canadian state or the Crown, or on the US side with the US federal government or the colonies, depending on the period. So there is a foundation for implementing this work. It's just whether or not we have the willingness to right historical wrongs. So what does legal personhood for water look like? Well, it means that we create legal enforcement mechanisms for the protection of water as a living entity so that it may exist, flourish, and naturally evolve. Really, a big part of that is to prevent human contaminants and human pollution from impacting the water in its entirety and looking through the whole of the water ecosystem of a particular water course. And I think that that's really important when we think about the climate crisis, because many of our existing water governance instruments, legal mechanisms for water protection, are not modernized for dealing with climate change. And so legal personhood could be one way in which we modernize existing legislation and laws to address the climate crisis as it pertains and affects water. It also says that we should have co-governance arrangements. So really making sure that that aspect of water justice, the fairness, equity, and participation is embedded in the legal system. That there are water guardians, so folks that are charged with making sure that they are trustees of the water and thinking of the water's best interests. That it pertains to a holistic approach, and that it also dismantles probably one of the biggest obstacles to legal personhood for water, which is this idea that is embedded within the common law systems of many countries around the world, which is the exclusive ownership of water. So seeing water solely as a property right and as property. So again, that aspect of commodification of water is very much embedded within our legal systems because it's only viewed as property. And so that has to change and be transformed. And it's happening around the world. We saw in New Zealand, the Whanganui River and Aotearoa being granted legal personhood, the Ganges River, although currently being contested in the court. The Yurok tribe in California granted legal personhood through their tribal sovereignty to the Klamath River. And here in the Great Lakes region, the city of Toledo granted legal personhood to Lake Erie, although it's also being contested because these waters are shared jurisdictions. They're shared by multiple political entities. And that is where we often see conflict in making decisions about water and what are the appropriate processes for making those decisions. But I think we need to step above our, sort of, for lack of better words, our power tripping or our need to be always in control, particularly on the part of the Canadian and US states, and really say these problems are bigger than ourselves, and they are creating massive climate grief, massive water grief. And if we are to live up to the principles, if the Canadian state is to live up to the principles that it said it would by endorsing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, then granting legal personhood for water, working towards the Indigenous water justice in this country is fundamental to ensuring that that implementation and those endorsements are met, and the international obligations that were made are also met. So what can we do? Well, firstly, it's to restore that connection to water. Really start to understand how you can view water as a living relation. Find ways to connect to water, and also try to understand what does it mean for the water closest to you, or for the water that you have a relationship with. What does it mean for that water to be healthy and thriving? It's going to be different for localities across the world, and this should be a localized conversation and a localized decision-making process. Because although the water connects us around the world, it also has very unique challenges and obstacles at the local level. And so that means, being a great advocate, finding your voice, finding ways to be an advocate for the water. It means working on grassroots legislation. It means also learning about Indigenous rights. And I think the first place to start there is, what is the territory that you currently occupy, and who are the Indigenous peoples that have stewarded that territory for millennia? Get to know, that history, and then get to know the rights and the treaty protections that are in place there. And then also, again, find those ways to connect to the water. So I will leave you with this question. I think it's a great question for all of us to understand that, yes, there is a global responsibility. There's a nation-state responsibility on the part of the Canadian state and other states around the world to protect water. But we each have an individual responsibility. And it's what I call a call to action to be water citizens, to be citizens of the water, for the water. And I think a really fundamental question to ask ourselves every day as water citizens, folks who are really trying to support the ability for water to exist, flourish, and naturally evolve as it has on this planet for millennia, is to say, what have I done for the water today? small actions as individuals can really help to move the needle forward and to restore our connection and hopefully collectively be able to make some real sustainable and transformative change. So Tabutni, thank you. I know this is probably just a bit of a taste of water justice from an Indigenous perspective, from a Shinnecock woman, and I look forward to how this conversation evolves for the rest of today.
Oh, Kelsey, thank you so much. Thank you so much for those words. I'm Arlene. We've emailed and I haven't had a chance to meet you yet. It's wonderful to listen to your words there. And I'm finding that, you know, in all that you shared, there's so much that's I'll be digesting for a while, but something that feels like it's really landing right now is that in the movements that many of us in this audience are part of, climate justice movements, water advocacy movements, that we've been doing things in a certain way for a long time. And as you pointed out, the crisis continues to plummet and be real, and that we fundamentally need to make a choice to engage this in a different way. And I'm really grateful for that invitation and for the conversations that this will begin here. So thank you so much for joining us.
You're so welcome.
And Kelsey, what you said has really provided a very clear way for us who are not Indigenous to reflect on what it means to be inside of a colonial government structure and to start to think about what goes beyond that. You know, and I want to share that I worked on the statement that we're introducing to people today with the committee. And I want to do a shout out to Paul Baines here as I do this, because all of this, he brought some of this to us and he's opened it up to us. And Watershed was on the committee from Six Nations as well. And frankly, a lot of this is new conversation for me, And one of the things that Paul said, he was quoting somebody who said, when people who work on petitions have the most effect on people who work on developing them. And in some ways, the development of the statement that we have today has had a profound effect on me. I want to share that personally. Your conversation reinforces and extends that. And it's actually our hope, and this is an introduction to the document, it's actually our hope that our invitation is to invite people into this conversation, invite non-Indigenous people in particular into this conversation so we can open up and understand this. And for what is maybe outside of our normal frame of reference to become normal, to go beyond our dominant frame of reference. I found many, well, I just want to say frankly that I think our introduction connects with what you said, and I'm relieved. There weren't a lot of moments where I was going, oh no, we didn't talk about that.
I had the pleasure and the privilege to read it in advance, and I think you guys are on the right track. It was a great document to see progression in this space.
So we did put the link in the chat box, and we do know that we're bringing this to you for the very first time. You haven't had a chance to read it, and that's fine. This is, again, the beginning of a conversation, and I don't know, Arlene, if there's more that you want to say for a minute about your experience of working with the committee, and then what we're going to do is we're going to ask the audience a couple of questions, and then we've got 3 questions we're going to do a poll around. So Arlene, is there something you want to?
I just wanted to also share that this invitation that we have landed on, we all landed on it, and with the great big caveat that we could have easily spent years together working on something that would have pulled more in, but left it in the voice and the framing of an invitation. And just that within the committee that worked together on this, there was wide array of expressions and interests and things that didn't all get distilled into this invitation, and we tried to touch on as much of it as we could. But that I was so grateful for the variety, for the the vast different voices that were a part of it, and also a recognition of the voices that we need to bring more centrally into that conversation too. I think I'm holding both of those, and as this is currently sitting, it's an invitation and the beginning of how we want to move forward in make a space that feels comfortable to invite a more diverse set of people into their expression. So thanks to everyone on the committee, and maybe we'll just step into some of those questions. So thanks again, Kelsey.
Well, I think that Arlene, maybe what we want to do as the very first thing, I'm watching the clock as we do this, is Kelsey asked us the question, who is justice for? And I'm just going to ask the audience to comment on that. If we're talking about water justice, who do you think that means that's water for? Or pardon me, who that's justice for? And that might be your own personal view. It might be an organization or a group that you're part of and the work that you're doing. And a 15-second delay between when we talk and when you hear us. So vamp here for a second until people can hear start to come some of the comments. So let's just have a look and see what's coming in. Who is justice? Who is the justice? Who's the justice for that we're working for? I can't figure out my grammar on that. But
yeah, future generations, animals, Indigenous rights. Yeah, every living entity within the watershed and ecosystem. These are great.
Well, I've just been told by our tech people, no delay in session. So there you are. Okay.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, we wanted to have an understanding that you all haven't probably had a chance to thoroughly read the invitation. We wanted to read off the first few, which are questions that we can engage today. Some of the later questions are things that we are sending as invitations for us to join in past this gathering and in ways to invite you into evolving that conversation firstly. So the first and fundamental premise in the invitation towards a water justice agenda is that there is a rupture in the reciprocal relationship between humanity and nature. By that, we mean the dominant society believes it is separate from nature and over nature, not within nature. What do you think about this premise? And we have a poll that we'd like to invite you to take, and it just may take a few moments. We're going to hope that
I don't know if it's Travis or Megan who are supposed to be posting the poll question right now. And the poll
is up.
You have to.
Oh, you have
to click on polls.
Yeah.
So you'll see poll question number 1. Do you feel that your relationship with water has been ruptured? Yes, somewhat, no, unsure.
Okay.
And when I click on it, it says, thank you for voting. This poll result is only visible to the organizer. So I don't know if the setting has to be changed so that we can all view it. So nice to be able to talk to the tech people live.
Take a moment while this is happening. That is as bizarre a time as we find ourselves in, and having to do this all electronically. That I send my gratitude out to the devices that we are on and the infrastructure that allows this to happen, so that we can still do this work even during a pandemic. So I think, hi, Danny.
Hi there. I was just going to join to tell you the results of the poll from the votes that we've got so far. Apparently only the organizers behind the scenes here can see it. So hi, everyone. I'm Danny. I'm the program manager with the Water Watchers. So we have about 50% of people, a little over, say that yes, their relationship with water has been ruptured. 28% say somewhat. 13% say no, and 6% are unsure.
Okay, thank you.
So you're going to stay on screen with us, Danny, or are you going to jump back and forth?
I'll jump back and forth.
All right. So the second question, or the second, well, our fundamental premise is that that relationship has been ruptured. And then we propose that at the roots of the rupture are colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacy. And we talk a little bit about this in the invitation. There's also a discussion document that goes into it in a little more detail, which you can click and read. And the discussion document's a draft. And this is part of the conversation we're going to extend out beyond today. But it leads us to the next question we want to ask you is, do you think decolonization is integral to the work to protect water? Decolonization can mean lots of things, but for example, do we have to change who regulates and who makes laws about water? Do we need to create ways to co-govern water between First Nations and governments representing the Crown? Do we need to have co-governance within watersheds so that everybody who's a stakeholder or a water guardian or has an interest in the water in their watershed has some opportunity to participate in its governance? So the second poll question is up. Do you think that decolonization is integral to your work to protect water? Please take a moment to answer the poll. And when we have results, I think Danny's going to join us again.
Hi there. I'm watching the numbers jump around as people navigate and then reflect and choose the answer that's most authentic for them. But we have about 75% of people saying that decolonization is integral to work to protect water. 20% say somewhat, and about 3% are say no and unsure.
Okay. All right. And then there's another question that follows from that. And if it is true that this invitation proposes that capitalism is a root cause of the rupture, and that it is a problem when governments put profit ahead of people and nature. And so our question is related to that. And I'm hoping we have another poll that just says, I wanted to just take a moment here. Things that we might consider. Oh, just one sec. Here's the poll. Do you feel that government puts profits before people? Is the essence of this question. And you know, as you're responding and answering to that, there's some of the thoughts that we thought about in the committee was that we could work to declare water a public good or a common heritage. We could work to prohibit the commodification of water. Things like prohibiting the privatization of public water utilities and water sources, and questioning the need for extractive industries that disturb, pollute, contaminate, and destroy groundwater and surface waters, particularly and disproportionately in Indigenous communities and communities of color, and making the full costs of environmental protection and waste management the responsibility of those who produce these costs, and centering the social well-being of the many rather than the economic wealth of the few. So yeah, I think maybe folks have had a time. Oh, we can see the poll results here now.
Yes, we can.
That's fabulous.
Awesome.
So yeah, it looks like many are saying, 59% are saying often, 33% saying always, sometimes 7%, and never 2%. So it sounds like at least many of us on this call are feeling that that might be an area for our focus.
I think I wanted to say that a couple of things about sort of the strategy behind this document and about the process going forward. And I know from talking with lots of people who work in organizations that we focus on policy, we focus on regulations, either maintaining, improving, stopping the cuts of. And it's very important, and that is important work that's governments need to implement to protect water quality, water quantity. I think, however, that we can be too inside those details, and we need a way to talk about these issues to the average person more in popular ways. And I hope you'll forgive my little sort of joke right now, but what do we want? More water regulation. When do we want it? Now? That's a hard chant to get the process, to get people to rally behind. And framing it in terms of justice is more meaningful to people. It's the higher moral ground that people understand and connect to. And embedded in the questions that we're asking in the invitation towards the water justice agenda, we hope is a higher moral ground. That justice is the issue around which people can connect with each other. And that those things are rooted therefore in our relationship with nature, in the past injustices that colonialism, capitalism, and white supremacy have caused, and capitalism as well. And those aren't necessary. That's not necessarily the language we're going to be able to use when we go out and talk about it in public with people to draw them into this. But it's important that we understand that these are the roots of what it is and how to be able to go beyond that. I'm going to go to the chat box for a second. Sandy Shaw, the MPP from Dundas, is with our session today, and she's posted a link to the Coutts Paradise Water Accountability Act, which you can look at. And you may be familiar with the problem that happened in Hamilton with sewage being released. I'm not sure there's a better word, being released into the Coutts Paradise area, and that the politicians, the local governments were aware of that and weren't reporting it. And while that's an example of a regulation that could be changed and could be improved, the intention of the invitation to water justice is for us to go beyond that, to think of a broader, while that is an example of a regulation that's important, we need to go beyond that in thinking about how we protect water. So, Arlene, I think we've got about 5 minutes left, so we can see comments that other people want to make in the last 5 minutes about this, and then maybe we'll take a minute to describe what the next steps are in the towards water justice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was also just thinking we could take a moment to even read those questions from the water justice statement, the next two, by way of invitation. Because, yeah, this is the invitation to consider and reflect on is a personal reflection, and then beyond that, ways that we might be able to come together to move this work together in a more integrated way forward. I think I might just read question 4, if that's. So the fourth part of our invitation was, do you want to be part of a more integrated water campaign that links together various racial and socioeconomic injustices? If so, how do we center the intersection of water security and racial and social justice in our work? And we considered that we might begin by recognizing that access to clean drinking water is a result of long histories of colonialism that deny this right to others. Recognizing that our unequal access to resources is also the result of white privilege. Recognizing that human rights and social and economic justice must become central in our environmental work through the building of coalitions and the practicing of thoughtful allyship.
And Arlene, I'll just pick up on that in terms of what's going to happen next is that we're in the next phase of the People's Water Campaign. We're going to reach out to you, to other organizations, and ask you to reflect on these questions and provide support for that. What implications do these questions have for us as individuals, as communities, as organizations in which we're a member? Do you know a pivotal water leader who needs greater support? And there's a link at the bottom. Email us at waterjustice@waterwatchers.ca. We'd be happy to receive any comments or questions. And the Water Watchers, and through this campaign, we're going to host and facilitate ongoing conversations. And as a preliminary on a preliminary basis, we're thinking that we're going to reconvene us probably around World Water Day in March, around this aspect of around this conversation about water justice, and to develop a campaign plan that supports moving in that direction. So watching the clock, Arlene, we got 2 minutes left before we got to switch out to go to the workshops. I'm scrolling through the comments.
Mike, I'm wondering if we also, I meant to do this earlier, but to invite those who are on the committee, if there are comments that you'd like to share in the chat, or if we can bring your voice forward. And at this moment, we'd love to just, make sure that this was a group of us that pulled this together, and that there are many pieces that are important to be shared in that process.
So as we watch for those comments in the chat in the last minute before we have to scoot out, again, thank you to Andrew Muhlebach, Rod Whitlow, Franklin Frederick, Paul Baines, Laura Hamilton, Tamana Kohi, for all your hard work bringing this invitation together. Thank you, Kelsey, for your the context that you set for our conversation today. Arlene, you get the last word, and you get to tell people where to go.
Okay, so I guess the last word is just that, we've been talking about moving in this direction for some years, and I'm sitting with what Kelsey reflected, that if we are going to be successful in actually getting to water protection and ecological health overall, that we really do need to reimagine how we approach water advocacy. And I'm grateful for that reflection. I'm grateful for all the folks that are doing that work and have been doing it for a long time, and really excited to be moving forward in the water community of folks doing, current modern day water advocacy, to start to really center in on these very, very important questions. So thanks for joining us. And we do invite you to stay and participate in those ongoing parts.